Hi, everybody. My name's Sean McBride, and welcome to the Breaking the Silence podcast put on by Addiction Rehab Toronto. I'm here today with our guest, Justin Heath. Justin is a social worker and a psychotherapist. He has 17 years experience dealing with mental health and addiction issues. He himself is 20 years sober, and he's worked for fine establishments such as CAMH and multiple sober living communities all around Toronto and the surrounding area. So, Justin, first of all, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Awesome. And as I was saying, Justin focuses a lot on social work and addiction. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, what you're currently involved in and your role?
Yeah, sure thing. So as you mentioned, I got into this field in part by discovering my own addiction. I was going to school to become a social service worker at a practicum placement, and day one, 9 a.m., was an AA meeting that I got to sit in on. And I discovered that the people that were sharing, who were much different from me and came from a much different background, were saying things that I felt and I thought. And I was as shocked as anyone that I identified with what they were saying. I knew I was struggling. I knew alcohol and cannabis were part of that. But I had no idea that this was the problem and that there was a solution. And so I eventually became an addictions counselor in a 12-step modality at a couple places in Toronto. Went back and got a master's and worked at CAMH for 13 years, and more recently moved into private practice. So I offer online private practice therapy for people for addiction, mental health, and trauma.
That's fantastic. It really does. You kind of hit a nerve with me too, is when you do see other people, sharing their problems and you think, no, that's not me. And then, one or two key phrases or stories come out and you're like, oh, wow, wait a minute. Maybe that's more something I need to address in myself, and that's great that kind of inspired you to become an addictions counselor afterwards. Wow. Yeah. And you were with CAMH for 13 years. I didn't know that. That's fantastic. Let me ask you, when it comes to addiction itself, do you feel that people see it as a separate entity from who they are? And is that necessarily a good thing? Is that something that you work with people to kind of overcome?
Yeah, I often see the opposite, where people can take a position where it becomes all they are, it becomes an identity in a way that can be, elicit shame and also a sense of stigma. And these become problematic because so much of healing is about relationship, accessing support, feeling free to be honest about what's going on. And so if there's this kind of weight that people are carrying in how they're defining themselves, that's something that can actually impair the movement forward. And so that's something I try to work with people on, is how do we want to define this? What is it that you're dealing with, rather than something that's externally defined, perhaps by a checklist in the DSM of how severe your addiction issue is. Really trying to understand its purpose in your life, its function, and how you relate to it. And I find that's the way that frees people up from the shame and stigma. And we have a lot more to work with when they're in that space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. It is very hard to get someone to not only be honest with you as their, their psychotherapist, but also for them to be honest with themselves and kind of realize, hey, you know what, this is the nature of it. So I guess a question on that vein is, why does it matter how addiction is defined to the individual?
Yeah, and so I offer kind of a bit of some foundational beliefs for me that inform this. And one is the main basis of the therapy I offer is narrative therapy. And one of the beliefs in that system is that we don't have access to all the facts. And so we create stories. We interpret things and we make up stories to fill in the gaps. Some of these stories can be limiting, restricting, shut down possibilities. And they can become so repeated and dominant that we stop noticing them. It's just the way it is. There are also stories that can offer more hope and possibilities and a different perspective on things. We call these subordinate stories, but they tend to not be told. They're kept in the shadows. They don't match the overall belief. For example, some people think I'm a loser, or I can't do this, or I can't do that. And so they filter their experience to kind of verify that. And these things that show capacity or show other aspects of themselves are missed. And so I try to explore with people the story they're telling about their addiction and how they understand it, how they relate to it. The other thing that informs me is Buddhist philosophy. And one of those concepts would be that we create the world with our thoughts.
For sure.
So if we can change our thoughts, we can change the world. If we change what we attend to, we see the world differently. And so really trying to work with people to be mindful of the stories they're telling and therefore the stories they're living out and what might be more helpful, supportive stories, because facts are few and stories and interpretations are many. And so there may be something that's, going to help you move forward more than that.
That's a really powerful perspective. A lot of my own healing, actually, someone who's kind of a personal guru to me says something along those veins. Dr. Joe Dispenza, and he says, when you change your personality, you change your personal reality. So, kind of in vein with what you're saying, you're right. The stories we tell ourselves and our perspective on ourselves does shape the world around us. So no, that's really deep. I like that. And I like that you have that kind of holistic, functionality, because a lot of people just stick to very clinical modalities in the way they help people heal and kind of have this is the one route. It seems like you have a more broad understanding and incorporation of multiple different modalities and techniques, which is amazing. I mean, you're right. Healing's not one size fits all, right? So.
Exactly. And I try to see whatever issue brings someone to therapy, whether it's addiction or mental health or trauma, that's a catalyst for it. But I try not to let it define everything that we're doing. It's what brought you here. It's what opened you up to doing things differently. And we try to get at what the actual issue is often I see addiction as a symptom of something else. It's not the issue. It's an attempt to cope with the other issues. And so if we get too hyper-focused on the addiction, sometimes we miss that we're treating the person. We're trying to figure out who this person is. And when you stop using your addictive behavior, recovery doesn't stop. It actually starts. That's the beginning. And a lot of people imagine that once I can get free of this addiction, which would be amazing, and some people feel impossible, I will have done it. And it's hard to hear sometimes that actually that just allows you to do the other work to deal with what brought forward the addiction.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate to that. Actually, you're right, because once you kind of separate the two, then the real work begins, right? Do you agree? It's been said a lot of times, but do you believe that there's a point in healing and recovery where you can say, okay, like, this is a safe plateau? Or do you believe in the concept that healing is non-linear? You can go up and up and up, and then sometimes you're going to dip and go back. Or do you feel like there's a place where you come to in your recovery, especially with you, having 20 years, having gone through, 17 years experience, do you feel there's a place where you can say, no, I'm recovered now? Or do you think it's constantly back and forth?
Yeah, and so in narrative therapy, and just me as the person I am, I love words, right? And when one person says recovery, it might mean something totally different for someone else. Some people don't even like that word at all, and we edit it and change it to something. But rather than recovering from addiction, I view it more as, what are you trying to reclaim? What are you trying to take back? For me, I'll give a personal example. When I was in the midst of my addiction, it felt like Groundhog Day. Every day was the same. It was never going to change. It was never going to get better. It could only get worse. And this was just an inevitability. And I was very stuck and there were no possibilities. Yeah. On my 1-year medallion, I put the word purpose because that's what recovery gave me. It gave me a purpose. And what that was for me personally was to grow spiritually and to help others. And it was a purpose that was a bedrock I could build my life on. Yeah. Because no matter what, I can keep growing. And no matter what, I can try to help other people. And the two actually feed into one another. The more I grow spiritually, the more helpful I can be. Yeah. The more I reach out and try to support and help others, the more I grow spiritually. And so I don't see recovery as, I guess in the beginning, I felt like I was trying to recover from my addiction. And it made it feel like my addiction was something that was like hiding in the bushes. And if I wasn't careful, it could come out and get me. I had to have this vigilance against falling backwards. And I think the big shift was when I started to set my sights forwards. What am I trying to move towards rather than what am I trying to move away from?
Wow.
And that changes everything, and the energy and the intention that comes from that, it becomes a life's work, which on bad days, that might feel like, oh, I got to do this for the rest of my life. But on a good day, I have meaning and purpose in each day. And that this is something that is not just about going to 12-step meetings for me. It's about trying to grow as a person and trying to share that message.
Wow. I really like that, because I think a lot of people have this idea in their head, aside from all the other stigmas, that once the addiction's gone, everything's going to be sunshine and rainbows, and I'm never going to have a bad day. And I think it's essential that you just won't have the same kind of bad day. And what you talked about, that Groundhog Day, it's funny, actually, the movie was just on the other day, and I remember going through those times where I'm like, this is just, same thing. Each day I'm going to wake up, and that drudgery. And you're right, you do need that purpose. You need that reason to kind of dig deep and be like, no. Like, I am going to reach a place of peace and ease, and, where it won't feel like that constant struggle daily with yourself and the world around you, essentially, right? So, no, thank you very much for sharing that. As a therapist, why do you feel it's important to empower people to be the ones that are defining their reality and how they see their addiction? Why do you feel that's so crucial?
Yeah, it ties in with what we just talked about, right? It depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to be free of the specific addictive behavior that you're in at that time, right, then it may be, you can go on what other people tell you or trying to follow some kind of prescribed way of doing things. But if you're working on a larger project, where you're trying to change your life and think about who you want to be in the life you want to have, then you're going to need to take ownership of that project. And you're going to have to recognize that you are one of one. There is no universal definition of this. There is no universal treatment that is guaranteed to work. You're going to have to find it, and it's going to be different as you move through your journey. What works at 3 months sober may not work at a year. It may not be the thing that you need. And so there are two things when I look back that really helped me in my recovery, which was taking responsibility for it and developing discipline. I didn't have discipline. And now both of those words can make people bristle. They're words that people may want to avoid.
Yeah, it sounds like hard work, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And I try to redefine them a little bit and really look at the meaning of it. For me, responsibility means that I have the ability to respond differently. And the only way I can do that is if I take ownership of it. That, there's a saying, you alone can do it, but you cannot do it alone. It's not to say that I'm going to figure this all out. I need other people. I need relationship. I need mirrors that are going to help me see what I can't see.
For sure.
But I do need to take on that, change is possible. I think that's what responsibility offers, right? If I make different choices, I haven't seen Groundhog Day in a while, but I think Bill Murray makes different choices along the way. It's different outcomes. Yeah. That's what we have to do. So we have to believe it's possible. And then discipline, the meaning of that word is disciple, or to be taught, or to be open to learning. So if I believe change can happen and I'm open to learning a different way from what I've been doing, now I have something. And that means I can stay engaged in that process, not just till I get a year sober, not just till, my anxiety reduces, but as staying engaged in my life day by day.
Wow. Yeah, I really like those definitions for sure. And you're right. When it comes to discipline and responsibility, it does make a lot of people say, oh my God, that sounds like heavy lifting, right? And I think that kind of scares them. But the way you defined it is really, it's empowering. It's really good. I like that. And I do find that the choices we make really are the key, right? Do you deal with just substance and alcohol, or do you deal with process addictions as well, like gambling and whatnot?
Yeah, process addictions as well. And again, it's kind of, it's trying to, whatever brings someone there. People don't really want to hear this at the beginning, and they may not be open to it until later. But whatever brings you to a place of willingness is a gift. It's an oddly shaped gift. It's not one you would have asked for, But I think about myself getting to the low point that I got to, that I had to go to AA. I just was desperate, and I would do anything. And that opened me up to being willing to do something different. So regardless of what brings someone, I'm not as interested in the thing, the addictive behavior. I'm interested in what's driving it. I'm interested in what's been unexpressed, what purpose it's serving, because when we can name the needs that are being met or we perceive are being met by the addiction, then we can start getting interested in other ways to meet them. We can legitimize, if you're using to feel less lonely and feel disconnected, if you're using to regulate your mood, if you're using to reduce your anxiety, those are all legitimate things that, of course, people would want. The question is just, how do we get there? And can we do it with less consequence? And can we develop confidence that there might be another way to do this? The tricky part for a lot of people is addictive behaviors can be survival strategies. They help people get through incredibly difficult times.
For sure.
And so some part of the mind says it worked. I'm still here. I made it through. And so it doesn't release its grip on that until it has some hope and faith and belief that there might be another way that could work. And that's why 12-step programs and people with lived experience sharing about their journey is so helpful, because it offers people hope that maybe there's another way. And I call hope the fuel of recovery. You have to have it, and you have to stoke it.
Totally agree. Well, like 100%. I remember, I was going through my own trials and tribulations, and I'd have people, sending me memes or sending me different links and being like, hey, look at this person. They're going through the same thing. And I was like, I really don't care. I'm here. I'm experiencing this. You could tell me 7 million people have the exact same experience. They're my age. They're same thing. It didn't matter. It wasn't until I started to actually interact with people in real life and be like, okay, it's not the exact same, but I can see that they made it through. So maybe there's a chance. And you're right, that hope, even just, they always talk about the faith of a mustard seed. And it's true. Just that little spark can be enough to, get that engine going. Like you said, I really like the way you put that. And I guess kind of while we're in that vein, compassion seems to be a real cornerstone of what you teach. Talk to me a little bit about that. Like I was saying, I know that compassion is a cornerstone of, what you teach and how you help people. Do you feel that, because I kind of want to see what's the cart and what's the horse for people, who are kind of trying to understand, do you feel that self-compassion is necessary before you can kind of extend compassion to others? Or do you find it the other way, where when you start to show compassion for other people in similar circumstances, that can kind of be the wellspring for your own self-compassion?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because I think this is the crux of my work, is that there is no one answer, right? It depends on the person who's in front of you. There's some people, particularly people who have experienced trauma, there's often that they have great compassion for other people. And this can be true of people as well who are more other-oriented and maybe have difficulty with boundaries and placing themselves first. So they extend lots of compassion to others, maybe even in ways that are harmful to them, because they don't consider themselves. And then it can be the other way, that people kind of are able to kind of consider and have kindness for themselves, but have a view of threat towards others and difficulty extending it. So really, you find it where it is and you cultivate it. So one way that I try to kind of link together the difficulties of being harsh towards oneself or having compassion, harshness tends to manifest as either blame when it's against someone else, and shame when it's directed towards yourself. And when we're in blame and shame, there's a much higher likelihood we're going to act in a destructive way, either towards the people we're blaming or towards ourselves when we're stuck in shame. If we start with compassion, we have a much better chance of cultivating understanding, because we're trying to look at what is rather than judging it, which is what shame and blame are all about. What is here? And that develops understanding, which leads to constructive actions. And so I find it helpful to really, again, define the word. What is compassion? And its root, it means with and suffering. Those are its Latin origins. So to be compassionate is to be with suffering.
Wow.
Not a great sales pitch, right?
No, I get it though.
Be
Yeah.
with suffering, so you have to explain this a little bit to people. I give the example, sometimes you may be with someone who had just lost someone's passed away, and you just have no idea what to say. There's no right words. I'm sorry sounds hollow. You don't know what to do, but you just sit with them. You put your arm around them. You're there with them in their pain. That's compassion. What we try to do is, can we develop that stance towards ourselves? That when my fear comes up, when my anger comes up, when my grief comes up, rather than muting it, which a lot of addictive behaviors are about muting and shoving that down, or being selective. I only like these emotions, but not these ones.
Yeah.
Can we welcome all of it and be with it? And my view is compassion allows us to change our relationship to emotions rather than threatening, these things that knock down our door and intrude in our day and come unexpectedly. Could they be messengers? Could they be trying to tell us what's going on with us, what we need, what's wrong? And if we can stay long enough to listen, we might come up with some creative solutions we wouldn't have considered and more insight into what's happening. So I try to create a space where cultivating compassion for that person within themselves, but also approaching them with compassion, curiosity, what's here, non-judgmental. And this is kind of it facilitates seeing it modeled and then practicing it within themselves.
Wow. Yeah, I like that. And you're right. I know from even my personal experience, I was always very easy to comfort someone else, even on the smallest things or the biggest things, but I was never comforting myself. And you're right. Like, that's a massive kind of shift in the paradigm to be able to say, okay, well, wait a minute. You've probably heard the old saying where it's like, well, what would you say to a friend who is going through the same thing? And I'd be like, I'd be your biggest advocate. I'd, comfort you and whatnot. Now, what would you tell yourself? And it's like, suck it up. Like it's really hard to kind of shift that prism, right? But once you do, you're right. Like, again, that little bloom of, okay, maybe you don't go from I'm absolute scum to I love myself, but take it in little increments, right? Okay, I'm not the worst person in the world. Start there and kind of build it. So that's great. I think the work that you're doing and the way that you're doing it, I can already tell, just from our interaction here. I mean, it's leaps and bounds above the clinical cold approach of, well, how does that make you feel? And then, it's really good. I think that organic kind of kind, self-nurturing, self-loving approach is definitely needed in this world for sure. Mm-hmm. Justin, thank you very much. I've had a great time talking to you. Is there anything else, be it advice, be it, any kind of first steps for people out there watching this that you'd want to kind of impart before we wrap up? Or
yeah, I mean, one thing that I go back to again and again, you can Gabor Mate's quote about connection is the opposite of addiction. Yeah. Right? That addiction isolates us. The shame that it induced, shame tells you, don't talk about it, keep it secret, it can't be accepted. The antidote is in connection. And so now more than ever in our world, there are free support groups that you can access every hour of every day.
Yeah.
Many different modalities that can fit for you. You click a button, you can just listen. You don't even need to share, get a sense of what the space is about. But just knowing you're not alone, people do recover, there is a way forward, people do want to help, and you deserve and can have that support right now. And so I think a lot of people don't know how accessible it is, that you do not need to suffer alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about deserving help, that's huge. A lot of people, especially those that don't have self-compassion, they think that it's some kind of universal punishment, that they are where they are, or, because they, cheated on their taxes 5 years ago. That's why things aren't working out now. And I really like that you diffuse all that and help the person get back to not just who they are, but who they want to be. That's awesome. Yeah. And your website, justinheath.ca, yes. I believe that's your website. Is there any other links or anything that people could find you on? Or
you can find me. at Psychology Today just by putting my name in, but everything's there on the website if you want to know a little bit more about how I think. You can reach out to me if to ask a question or to set up a free consultation. So I meet with people initially to see if we might be a fit, to answer any questions that you might have. And yeah, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk with you, and appreciate the work you and Addiction Rehab Toronto are doing.
Likewise, Justin. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I really like the holistic approach. That's exactly what we're trying to do here, is heal the whole person, not just the symptoms, right? So, no, I really appreciate your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, Justin Heath, MSW, RSW, all around great advocate for mental health and addiction. And thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank those of you who are tuning in to Breaking the Silence for joining us, and be well. Thanks very much.
Yeah.